Okay, good morning. How is everyone? Welcome to this is the fourth video, but really the third installment of our look at 1984. In the first two videos, we looked at the landscape of this world, the setting, the infrastructure, the social relations, the characters, and so on and so forth. In our second part, we looked at the control of history and the control of language through this thing called Newspeak. What I want to do today is to now focus on 1984, now that we have that really full landscape laid out, to look at the so-called love story. This is a regime, once again, to call back the speech of Pausanias in the Symposium. That is a tyranny. It's a special kind of tyranny called a totalitarian regime, a kind of total control that uses technology to control people's behavior. And the most insidious and diabolical aspect of the control of this regime is that it doesn't seek to just control your body like slavery, but it seeks to control your mind such that you literally cannot have thoughts that deviate from the demands and expectations of the regime, and in essence, what it wants you to believe is true. And what it wants you to believe is true is the mechanism that keeps you controlled and maintains the order in this society. And what they say is true is the truth, right? It's very disturbing. So one of the fundamental threats to any tyrannical regime is bonds between human beings, bonds of love, bonds of dependency that are stronger than those to the regime or to the state itself. If my loyalty and my dependence is to another person, I'm going to tether myself and they're going to tether themselves to me, and therefore we're going to be strong. And that poses and strength provides freedom. So that poses an intrinsic threat to the regime. And we've seen in Pausanias' speech, they say in the Persian tyranny, which is this kind of the classic study of a tyranny in the ancient world, right? They did not promote any activities that facilitated strong emotional bonds of love and friendship between people, because divided people are weak and together people are strong. So if you divide and undermine their relationships, they're going to remain weak and dependent on the government, right? I mean, this is a strategy that is on display not just in tyrannies, but in every political organization there is. There are certain people fighting for more independence and certain people compelling people to be more dependent on resources outside themselves or outside their family or their immediate community, right? So there are really two love relationships. One is with Julia, and we've seen some of the motivations as to what brought them into a relationship to begin with. We'll discover, for example, that Winston had an utterly loveless marriage to his wife. And they're long since separated, and they don't allow for divorce and remarriage, but people are allowed to just kind of go on once they've provided children for the regime, and that relationships only exist within the context of serving the ends and needs and regime and no more. So that's one reason why he's hungering for a real connection, because he never had it to begin with in his domestic or conjugal relationship. And then, of course, the other thing is, it is part of his overall rebellion against the regime to carve out a psychic space outside the gaze, outside the control of the regime. And definitely it exists in his diary, but it also manifests in this relationship. So you have to see him carrying on this love relationship. He clearly has just a natural affinity for the mystery of Julia. She's seen, or if you read book one carefully, he sees her in glimpses at a distance in various functions, party functions, functions that the party compels people, like the 2 minutes hate and the calisthenic exercises and so on and so forth. and she's mysterious. She's a dark-haired brunette girl. There's just something appealing about her. Something, the unknown becomes attractive to him. And she's also young, and she's attractive looking, and she has a certain spirit. And I think he looks around the society and he sees most people are more zombie-like. They either lack a spirit because they just have been kind of beaten into compliance, or they're all afraid. You notice many of the characters, they're willing to rat people out. They're willing to capitulate to the fear of this regime, and Winston is not willing to capitulate to the fear. He has a certain type of intellectual courage, and of course this is what leads to his demise. Now, at the end of the book, whether he really is killed or not is another question, but he is certainly killed in spirit, right? So this relationship, from the part of view of Julia, she's a kind of a hedonist. She has a strong sense of her own kind of emotional identity, even her sexual identity. And this is a way she expresses herself. And Winston is a kind of, more than just a willing participant, but he's a person who can understand her in a certain way. Even though they're different characters, they have slightly different motives, but their motives are still to be with each other. And by the end of the book, it's really unclear what Julia really represented, whether she was truly in love with him, or whether she really represented a kind of honey trap, which is a kind of trap of seduction. Normally it's a woman seducing a man, but it can be reversed, and that draws them into their own demise. Now, whether she's a witting or unwitting, whether she knows that this is unfolding this way, used as a kind of bait to bring out the thought crimes, right, of Winston, because, you know, as we've seen in the symposium, and people know from the real lives, people do things in the name of love that are unusual and risky, and so on and so forth. And Winston takes all kinds of risks. When they first meet in Sherrington's apartment above the bookstore that they've rented out, they already sense the impending doom of what they have done, in the same way that Winston senses his impending doom when he opens that diary and even considers, even before he's written anything, right? Because that would be evidence. He feels he is guilty and doomed, fated to be arrested as a thought criminal before he's even put pen to paper. And that is really a testament to the extent to which this kind of panoptical world, panopticanism, this self-regulation, right, has controlled his own thinking. And even as he breaks free of it, he's still aware of the consequences. So there's something, they have a real love relationship. There's no doubt about that. But there's also something political going on here. Having this relationship is also a kind of a political statement. But I mean, to say it's political is really just to say it's personal. I think you see here that those two, it's not in some kind of quasi-activist sense, right? He's motivated to do this because he wants the freedom to have this space of intimacy, this space of emotion, this space of thought that is not permitted by the regime, right? Then O'Brien, right? So Winston has a fundamental curiosity about the regime, and because he is the type of person he is, an aware person who thinks, who has sufficient recollection, he's more than aware of the lurking injustice of this regime, but he doesn't know the extent of it, and he can't put all the pieces together. And so you might even say he's searching for a kind of intellectual partner to work through the nature of this regime, which has had direct impact on his life. This is not a theoretical, this is not an academic exercise for this character. Understanding the regime is also understanding his own life and how the pieces of the puzzle really fit together. And so there is a kind of love relationship or deep friendship with O'Brien, or rather he projects this onto O'Brien because he doesn't know where O'Brien really stands. Just like Julia is mysterious, so is O'Brien, and perhaps even more mysterious. So he seeks out O'Brien because he wants to know the truth. And O'Brien is in a position to know more than he does. And O'Brien is welcoming. And we talked about that powerful line in Aristotle in Book 8 that plays out in issues of deception and self-deception, which is that our desire for friendship arises quickly, but the reality of it does not. Our desire for friendship rises quickly, but the reality of it does not. And this goes true for love as well, right? We have this yearning, this deep yearning for a certain type of connectedness, the way we understand it, and we get involved and we discover that what we thought was what we were looking for is actually, what the reality of it is something slightly different, and it may actually turn out something to be something we didn't want. So before we hit home on really these two kind of love stories, and of course the relationship with O'Brien takes a very disturbing and dark turn in Book 3, and it's almost, there's all this foreboding and foreshadowing in Book 1, where this actually is the natural conclusion of where this has all been headed. And it actually we discover that this process of Winston ending up in the Ministry of Love, of all places, which is the law enforcement, and you could say the reprogramming or brainwashing ministry, this was destined to happen more than Winston could have ever realized. And we discover that O'Brien's relationship with Winston is something other and more expansive or pervasive than we first thought, and even than Winston first thought. He wasn't fully aware of what O'Brien really turns out. Well, let's just say it. O'Brien has been monitoring this character. There have been signs, telltale signs, that Winston is he's a deviant. He's a heretic, right? In religion, when you're not orthodox, you're heterodox, and you're a heretic. You are a non-believer, or a believer in the wrong way, in the wrong thing, and therefore you get punished. And the most perverse thing about this regime is the way it deals with people who are so-called thought criminals. Now, it should be said, if it's not clear to you about what the American regime represents in its First Amendment right, which really is not simply a right to free speech, or to publicize your speech, or to go out in public and say what's on your mind without fear of being thrown in jail or censored. Free speech is really connected with free thought. If you can speak freely, you can think freely. But if you can't think freely, if you can't speak freely, you cannot think freely, right? So what I'd like to do now, before we get into these love stories, such as they are, is to actually, there's a few things I'd like to touch on in the PowerPoint dealing with newspeak and political correctness and things of that sort. In Book 3 of the text, and it's been really building, and it becomes apparent throughout the text, but O'Brien explicitly states it. He says that what the party says is true is the truth. And that statement is really the essence of what political correctness actually is. Now, you've heard this term 1,000 times, PC, political correctness, so on. Y'all, most of you, being born sometime, in the last 20, 25 years, you don't know a world prior to the world of political correctness. Except, of course, if you were to go back, particularly in the comedy of, say, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. If you look at the comedy today, there are many people pushing back on it, like people like Dave Chappelle, who occupy this interesting, successful, but outsider position. He's probably the best example I can think of. But if you look at late night television and the so-called comedy that's presented on Saturday Night Live or any of these late night shows that are supposed to be funny, ever since Trump, you can disagree with Trump all you want, and it's the beautiful thing about a free country. But here's the thing. They have single-mindedly gone on a uniform attack of Trump and his supporters in all forms without, and basically making it a thought crime if you don't believe exactly what they believe in the way they believe it. And they have turned comedy into something that is just a political weapon rather than a truth teller. One of the beautiful things about comedy and humor is that at its most profound level, there's lots of, shits and giggles type stuff, slapstick type stuff, just fun, easy, light stuff. But at its most profound level, comedy is deeply philosophical because it's concerned with telling the truth. And even more importantly, it's historically, and this goes back to ancient Greek comedy with the very name, dramatic comedies, and comic poets like Aristophanes, that at the heart of comedy is telling the truth, and particularly telling the truths that we all know are in the back of our mind, but the rules of society, however they got imposed on us, the system, the man, the establishment, whatever it is, the media, who knows, many different factors involved. They're the truths that are in the back of everybody's mind, but we don't say them because we're too afraid to do anything other than conform to the false or overly politicized standards of belief that we're supposed to conform to if we want to get by in society. This is for Rousseau, those ideas of merit and beauty. But there's one thing Rousseau didn't include, which is clearly on display in 1984, ideas of truth. Ideas of truth, right? The party has the truth that's for its own sake, and it has nothing to do with the actual truth. And it's not truth at all. But for the party, truth is just a word. So what does political correctness actually mean? Look at this statement. And I'm going to read it, but then explain to you the origins of this statement. So political correctness comes out of communist thinking and the promotion of Marxist communist ideology, right? So in that alone, you should be rather surprised that political correctness, let me be clear. When we talk about political correctness, we're not talking about good manners. We're not really talking about being polite or being respectful or not being hurtful. What we're talking about is the demand of some elite to toe the line of some political position, even as it flies in the face of the truth of the world we see around us on the everyday basis. So before I read this comment was actually a joke that people who lived under the oppression of totalitarian communist regimes actually used to say to one another. And ironically, we embrace this statement in a non-ironic, non-humorous way as serious. That should be rather shocking to you. It says, comrade, because in communist regimes, everybody's like a brother, right? Everybody's your family. It's the ideal of collectivism. We talked about that in the first lecture. Comrade, your statement is factually incorrect, right? So the premise here is somebody said something that's actually factually not true. And the other guy responds, says, and you tell him it's not true. And he says, yes, it is. He's acknowledging it's not true. But it is politically correct, right? So this joke about people being forced to toe a political line in the face that contradicts the actual facts of the case has been turned into our reality. So this is from an article that actually goes into the history and origins of political correctness by a guy named Angelo Codevilla. It says, the notion of political correctness came into use among communists in the 1930s as a semi-humorous reminder that the party's interest is to be treated as a reality that ranks above reality itself. Right? The party's interest, or you might say the party's truth, or the party's statements, is to be treated as a reality that ranks above reality itself. All right, so the word in 1984 for political correctness is simply newspeak. They are words that present the truth as the party would like it to be and contradict the facts that are right before our eyes. There's that famous line from Groucho Marx, who are you going to trust, me or your lying eyes? So the party says, who are you going to trust, the party or your lying eyes? Right? Your lying eyes are not lying. They're telling the truth, right? You get it? So, and this is an example of doublethink, because what happens is every human being, which is to hold two contrary and opposed opinions or beliefs simultaneously at the same time, and then both to be true. And political correctness really requires this. And this is why political correctness is really, it's not being polite. It's not about being sensitive to people. Those things are all, we all know that those values are good. We all know that when we're entered in sensitive discourse with someone else, that we should treat them as we would want to be treated, as as equals, moral equals, right? But does that mean that we shy away from important truths that, if stated and understood, really change how we understand the world we're looking at, right? That's what we're talking about here. Now, we can all talk about being sensitive in appropriate ways, but when we're covering over fundamental truths about the nature of our society in a false service to what's not really about politeness at all. It's about control. It's about thought control. And it's about changing the language so we can't think certain thoughts. I can't be more clear. It is exactly the same as Newspeak. So it's doublethink because of this. Because it's morally or politically true, quote unquote, to believe X. But your eyes, the evidence of your eyes, tell you something exactly contrary. And what do? You hold to the two in the same. And what's part of the problem here are concern to conform to the expectations of society. You'd have to have courage to overcome and speak the truth. And it's not just in this society, it's in any society. Speaking the truth is never welcome a lot of the time, because people establish successes of various kinds on things that are not fully true. And to speak the truth is to undermine the successes other people have in a lot of instances. Okay, so what I've done here is embedded a couple URL link videos of George Carlin speaking about political correctness. I want to say in the last 10, 15 years. He died a few years back. But this man, he is a comic, but he is also a truth teller. He is like a walking Socrates on stage. He tries to hold a mirror of truth up to us and show us who we really are by being direct and bold. And he says, among other things, political correctness is fascism pretending to be manners. Fascism, among many other things, is an ideology that what we say is true, right? Full stop. Now, what's interesting is politically, George Carlin is, I don't want to pigeonhole him too much because he's not a guy that's easy to pigeonhole, but I would say he's a kind of old-fashioned liberal, an old-fashioned leftist who is like, he was around for a long time, started in the 60s. He was against the Vietnam War, and he spoke out up against our government. A lot of positions that traditionally were associated, have been associated with the left. He's concerned for the ordinary guy or ordinary gal, right? And yet, he has a perspective that truth, for him, is more important politically than advancing a political agenda that is founded on lies. So let's be clear what he's saying here. He's saying political correctness is our newspeak, and it sure is. Now, I just skipped over the quote we read about doublethink from the text, and so it's in here in the PowerPoint. But if you don't think doublethink is something that has been a real historical fact in the world, think again. This is a quote from Joseph Stalin, right? The leader of totalitarian communist Russia, when it reached its most authoritarian, its most totalitarian, consisted of purges, the murder of millions of people, putting people in forced labor camps, only to be topped by the Chinese, who have killed roughly, in the last 60, 70 years, 100 million of their own people. 100 million of their own people. So here he gives a perfect example of double speak. He says, "We are for the withering away of the state." Now, if you know anything about Marxism, one of the things he posited was that the proletariat, the working industrial class people coming out of the 19th into the 20th century would rise up and overthrow the government, and there would be a brief period of the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. And then once they had accomplished their revolution completely, the state would wither away, and there would be no more need for government control at all. And we'd have this kind of utopia where people would, and communities would regulate themselves. So he talked about the state like government. Imagine we just don't have government, right? So if you think about the two characters in Mending Wall, the guy who doesn't want the walls believes we can function without them. And one way to translate that is he thinks people can regulate themselves enough to not have government at all. Right? So he says, we are for the withering away of the state. And at the same time, we stand for the strengthening of dictatorship. Yes, he really said that. And if you accept that logic, you've already accepted 1984 as something that we should celebrate and bring on. At the same time, we stand for strengthening the dictatorship, which represents the most powerful and mighty of all forms of the state, which have existed up to the present day. So notice, it's not just opposites, but it's extreme opposites between the disappearance of the state and the strongest form of state that has ever existed. And what he's talking about there is totalitarianism. The highest development of the power of the state with the object of preparing the conditions of the withering away. So what is the whole insane rationale of Marxism? You can't get the withering away of the state until the state has become more powerful than it ever has been comparatively in history. Now you think about that. Think about the state that has the most power. Do you think it's on the path to giving up its power? Those people who run that state, who have the most power in history for various reasons, do you think they're about to give up their power? Right? Who are you going to trust? Them or your lying eyes? Right? It says that is the Marxist formula. Well, this is a perfect example of doublethink. We have to hold two things that are completely contradictory simultaneously. He says, is it contradictory? Yes. Is it contradictory? But the contradiction is a living thing and wholly reflects the Marxist dialectic. Right? If you accept that logic, I got a bridge to sell you, right? And if citizens accept a logic like that, I can only say that any nation, any community is on a path to tyranny. So let's be clear that Newspeak was not really an invention of Orwell. I mean, he devises that name and he crafts a kind of edifice of Newspeak within the realm of 1984, the novel. But the reality of this type of euphemistic distortion of language and it's the doublethink that it entails is something that is fundamentally consistent with history, but not just totalitarian regimes, but advertising. American government is not immune to it. American businesses. And of course, there are varying degrees from like the most deeply disturbing to the rather trivial. But I would say that any society that sets its path, even in trivial ways, of not being honest with itself, by distorting its language intentionally, is setting up a very dangerous precedent. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, you have something called the final solution. And let me tell you, if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to tell you. But let's just say it's not to a math problem. Or it's not a solution to Fermat's last theorem, right? The parasite on the body politic, well, those were the Jews in Nazi Germany. They were understood as a parasite or cancer on the body of the collective nation, which was like understood as an organism. There's a great word Stalin used. We have to liquidate people, right? This is actually a term of economics, right? When you liquidate assets, you sell them off and you get cash for them, right? So there's a liquidation sale of like a company, a business, what have you, right? Here, liquidation means murder, but it has a kind of scientific neutrality to it that takes away that takes away the power of it. Stalin said something like the full emotional impact and the reality of it. Stalin said something like, 5 deaths is a tragedy. 5 million deaths is a statistic. You have to Google it for the exact, but it's close to that. Well, one slipped in there. We'll skip over that. I've got these mixed up. Hold on. So in 1984, the novel, the term is not liquidation, it's vaporization, right? And strictly speaking, what is vaporization? Vaporization is the process by taking a liquid and turning it into droplets, that float around gaseous in the air. And what this actually is the mass murdering of people through, I suppose, putting them in ovens and they go up in smoke, right? Some other really good ones, more contemporary, but still dealing with communist totalitarianism. In China, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. Now, the People's Liberation Army is not some small, like militia in China. That is the Chinese military, right? And let's be clear, they are not the People's Army. They are the party's army. And the party consists of a fraction of 1% out of the 1.5 billion people that live in China. And the People's Liberation Army do not work on behalf of the people. The next thing is, obviously then, they are not liberating the people. They are enslaving. They are controlling the people. So this is just a brutal and blatant and rather absurd euphemism. PRC, the People's Republic of China. China is not a republic. A republic is by definition a self-governing form of political organization in which the people, through representatives, more or less rule. I think we talked about it last time. The word republic comes from res publica. Publica has to do with the public thing, but it also has to do with the popular. The word public has its roots in the people. The people's, it's the people's thing. Right? So actually People's and Republic is redundant. It's not the People's Republic. It's the party's, you would call it the party's dictatorship of China, or you could call it oligarchical collectivism, in which the oligarchy is the party, right? And the people are collectivized beneath the party in a very highly unequal status. So this is a complete lie. They don't mention anything about communism. They don't mention anything about that effectively there's one ruler at the top and then a very small inner elite of people who make the decisions for the entire country. There's no representation. Republican government is predicated on various forms of representation. Actually, the North Korean regime gets even better. What is North Korea? It's a communist dictatorship, a totalitarian regime that explicitly enslaves its own people by not paying them for the work they do. That's called slavery. Do you know that in North Korea they actually send their citizens by force? There's no choice. You just go. They go to Africa. They work in factories there. The money that they make is sent back to North Korea, and the people who are working do not get the money. That is the essence of slavery. They don't have chains, they don't have manacles, they don't have whips, because they don't need it, because they can control them. So in North Korea, communist North Korea, it's called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So Democratic People's Republic, those are all actually redundant. Democracy is rule of the people. Republicanism is a form of democracy, right? But through representation rather than direct participation of citizens. So all those three terms are redundant. And why do they have to put all three of them? To really remind and reinforce in you that this is some kind of free regime. And it's a communist dictatorship. And I will tell you, almost any regime in the world that uses the words democratic and people's in their title, they are not either for the people or democratic in any way. So then recently we've had in New York and Virginia the so-called afterbirth abortion, in which if abortion has failed and the baby is born alive, that as the governor of Virginia said, we will make the baby very comfortable, and then the doctor will have a conversation with the mother if she'd like to still abort the baby. Now, a human being who is alive and killed without any proper legal justification, that's normally what we call murder, morally and legally. But now it's not called murder anymore, or infanticide, murder of a baby. And we're not talking about abortion at 2 months or 3 months. We're talking about a baby that has survived of an abortion, is alive, and is then killed after the fact, outside the womb. Now, we can have all kinds of reasonable disputes about what we think about abortion and its potential necessity in cases like rape and incest. Most reasonable people find that to be appropriate. But I think we also know instinctively and emotionally that abortion is just, at best, it's a necessary evil. It's nothing to be celebrated. It's nothing to be proud of. Sometimes it has to be done, and maybe you shouldn't feel ashamed of it. But when you think of what a woman does, even in a situation of rape and incest, that they have carried a child inside them, even when they think it's the right thing to do, to have an abortion, that must be one of the most difficult decisions that person could ever make in their life. And they don't make it joyfully, and they don't make it as an act of political assertion. It is a sad necessity in their life for whatever reason from their point of view. But here we're not talking about any of that. We're talking about a child who is born into the world and then killed after the fact. And if you don't believe me, you need only Google New York State and Virginia about this law that was passed about a year ago. It's on the books. This isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. And then there's something called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Right? That actually is in the Cold War area, when every nation, the Soviet Union, United States, has massive supply of nuclear weapons. And mutually assured destruction was the notion that nobody was going to start a nuclear war, because if you did, everyone would be obliterated. It'd be like all civilization wiped off the map. So nobody put their finger on the button. However, I mean, in one sense, mutually assured destruction perfectly, or just describes it. But once you make it MAD and you make it an acronym, like, nobody really knows the significance of what you're saying anymore. And you see that one solution to avoid people gleaning the full meaning of words in 1984 is to take something like English socialism, in which you very clearly understand that it's a political form called socialism, and it's an English variety. You make it INGSOC, and it just sounds like a bumper sticker label. It sounds like some kind of cool car company. I don't know. But it doesn't sound like what it really is anymore. So let's just finish up with some fun examples, right? So I love very trivial stuff here now. I love that Starbucks, when you order, if you want a small coffee, you have to order a tall. And if you want a grande, which means big or large, that's actually just a medium, right? I mean, I've never understood that really. And then venti makes it sound very Italian. You're getting it from the barista and all that stuff, right? A venti is the largest, and it's actually just it's the Italian word for 20. It's like the big gulp sounds like the biggest one, right? But then there's a super big gulp. And I love going into Starbucks and asking for a small, right? And they go, "Oh, you mean a tall?" I said, "No, I mean a small." Things like vertically challenged, right? We've been on. It's been 20 years in the United States that we can't state. It's like it's a slight to say one person is shorter than the other, or can jump higher than the other, or whatever it is. And these are rather trivial things, but I think they're indicative of our mindset, that we feel like we're walking on broken glass and we can't state the truth, not for the sake of hurting other people. Right? Sometimes the truth is hurtful to ourselves, to others. But, I mean, someone who's trying to be a truth teller is not trying to hurt another person. And I think we can all see the difference in intention and their point between someone who's just trying to hurt versus someone who's trying to be honest about the reality of things. Collateral damage, that's a great word from the military. When a missile's fired in, like they're trying to kill a terrorist, but they kill 200 people from a village, that's called, and they're not trying to kill those people, but they're in the way, they happen to be near the terrorist, that's called collateral damage, right? I mean, that sounds like something from Wall Street, right? It sounds like my collateral got damaged, right? It's really, if you didn't know what that word means, you'd have no understanding, like you couldn't infer it just from the meaning of the words. Hate speech, right? We constantly use this expression hate speech as if it has legal standing. It does not. Does not have standing. Free speech. I read some really interesting reports, done studies on college campuses over the last 5 years, saying that increasingly college students believed that free speech did not mean freedom to speak your mind, but it meant freedom from speech you didn't like. And here's the problem with hate speech. Who determines what's hateful? At a certain point, people start calling what's hateful anything that they disagree with, and things that are not at all in any way actually hateful, either in intent or in substance. Jerrold Nadler, he is a congressman from New York City, actually Manhattan, and he had one of the most amazing, I think he was talking about Trump-Russia collusion, and he said that the standard of proof and that the standard of evidence were two different things, right? Which makes no sense to me at all. Proof is based on evidence, and evidence is proof if that's what the evidence shows. You think of the Patriot Act. This was the Security Act passed in the aftermath of 9/11, right? And the Patriot Act actually, it's all heroic sounding and, you know, stand up for America, but it actually put a lot of our freedoms at risk, our basic Bill of Rights amendments, our rights at risk. It is now called, of all things, the Freedom Act, which it is really an act that is the antithesis. It is really the Unfreedom Act, if you have read about some of the provisions in it and how they have been used or abused by federal law enforcement. The Federal Reserve Program. Does anyone even know what the Federal Reserve is? Federal Reserve System? Well, interestingly, people like to say, because it is true, that the Federal Reserve is neither federal, it's not a reserve, and it's not really a system. The Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is the part of the executive branch that runs the military, right? And Department of Defense, the notion is that they only defend the country when they're being attacked. What did the Department of Defense used to be called up to World War II? It used to be called the Department of War. To put it another way, it used to be called the Department of Offense rather than Defense. Climate change. Climate change is a word you can make mean whatever you want. So, like, you don't have to make a specific claim with climate change. Like, you could be very specific about how you think the climate is changing, but when you just use the word climate change, it's a kind of catch-all for the climate can get colder and can get warmer. That's all climate change. So you can always win with this expression climate change, because you're always right, because certainly the climate is always fluctuating in one way or another. Another great one, if you're not familiar with them, Antifa. Antifa brands itself as a group of people that are anti-fascist, fighting against racist deplorables in society. They claim to fight primarily racism, but I've never seen them defend a person of color in my life. And everyone I've ever seen involved in Antifa is actually a white person fighting against other white people. And they claim to be anti-fascist, but they go out and use physical force against people instead of arguments and words. And they hit people with batons and ask questions later. And they do it to people who are not provoking them. They do it gratuitously. And Antifa, they are what you call fascists, right? And if you believe what they're selling with this name, you've completely fooled yourself. Political correctness, things like so illegal immigrant. What's an illegal immigrant or an illegal alien? Interesting, illegal alien. If you look at the laws on the books about coming to the United States illegally, the technical definition for someone who comes in the law, who comes to the United States illegally, they are called an alien, right? Just as there are people who are resident aliens who are here legally, who don't have official citizenship status, they're called resident aliens. Alien is not a term, a derogative term. It simply means you are foreign, and that is the legal term that's traditionally been used for some time, for decades, if not hundreds of years, right? So illegal means you're here unlawfully, therefore you're an illegal alien. Now, whatever we think we should do with people who come to this country from Central or South America or anywhere else, and they don't use the legal process, whatever you think the answer is, politically, policy-wise, I think what we're saying is, what's the problem with being honest about their actual status, right? So words we use now are like undocumented immigrant. What that really means is they're not citizens, and they came here, therefore, illegally. And then I heard Justin Trudeau, he's the Prime Minister of Canada, he described illegal immigrants simply as foreign travelers. Foreign travelers. Now, a foreign traveler is like someone who goes to Europe for a summer to, go to Paris, and that's a foreign traveler. We're not talking about foreign travelers here, people who are tourists going on trips, right? So here in these two clips, this one and the next one, I've given you some clips from George Carlin, who's the guy who said, that political correctness is fascism masquerading as politeness, right? And he really gives a deep analysis. One thing he's always fascinated by is language and how it's used. And his comedy, much of his comedy is really built around his kind of analysis of how we use words and what it says about us as a society. So what I'd like to look now is to look at the conjugal relationship between Winston and his wife, and then Julia, and then look at the relationship between O'Brien and Winston. So these are the page numbers that I'm going to read from, and I'm just going to start on page 165. And the key thing to keep in mind here is the way in which the personal relationships of the characters on the most intimate levels, on the level of not just spending time with one another, but on the emotional level, is controlled and dictated and regulated by the party. So in the middle of page 65, it says, the aim of the party was not merely to prevent men and women from forming loyalties, which it might not be able to control. Its real, undeclared purpose was to remove all pleasure from the sexual act. Now, we've seen in Rousseau that love or sex sits at the root of some of the most powerful drives, some of the most powerful emotions in human beings. And therefore, this is a kind of passion or desire that is hard to control. It's hard to control for individuals, right? They control their own desires and passions and feelings, because not only is there a desire for love and sex, but that desire in society, as it plays out, produces all kinds of other emotions: jealousy, envy, and so on and so forth, possessiveness. This is a near untamable desire. It is maybe like the arch desire. Therefore, in this society, it is the very thing that is necessitates the most control and regulation by the regime. The real and undeclared purpose was to remove all pleasure from the sexual act. Not love so much as eroticism was the enemy. Inside marriage as well as outside it, all marriages between party members had to be approved by a committee appointed for the purpose. And though the principle was never clearly stated, Permission was always refused if the couple concerned gave the impression of being physically attracted to one another. The only recognized purpose of marriage was to beget children for the service of the party. Sexual intercourse was to be looked at on as a slightly disgusting minor operation, like having an enema. This again was never put into plain words. So this is actually one of the really disturbing things about this regime, is that the rules are not in plain words. They're not spelled out. Remember, there are no laws. But to say there are no laws, it means that there are no clearly established moral rules at all, or laws at all. And people live in the dark about when they're transgressing and when they're not, because that decision is arbitrarily made by the party. There were even organizations such as the Junior Anti-Sex League, which advocated complete celibacy for both sexes. All children were to be begotten by artificial insemination, artsem, as it was called in Newspeak. Now, can you imagine sex, procreation, being substituted by artsem? Now think about that for a second. And brought up in public institutions. How do you control people? You take their children away from them and have them raised in Head Start preschools. This, Winston was aware, was not meant altogether seriously, but somehow it fitted in the general ideology of the party. The party was trying to kill the sex instinct. This is a rebellious and dangerous instinct, because sex is not really just about sex. That's the point. Or, if it could not be killed, then to distort it and dirty it. He did not know why this is so, but it seemed natural that it should be so. And so far as the women were concerned, the party's efforts were largely successful. All right, so the regime treats sex basically in a puritanical way. It wants to make you feel that sex is disgusting and that the sexual impulse is disgusting. And not because it isn't connected with love. That would be why we might find it unappealing. But simply because you have it and it exists. Now, if there's one great exception I would make to this book, if I were scheming as a diabolical genius about how to create a totalitarian society, I would not make it a puritanical one. In fact, if I really wanted to control people and make them tame and docile, I would give them bread and circus. I would let them slake their desires with pornography and music videos and constantly shower them with images of sex, and to transform their sexual impulse into something dull and banal and bestial or bestial, right? And I would take all the kind of human psychology out of it. I would return it to its primitive form. Well, if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because if you look at our society, it treats sex, for the most part, in an incredibly degrading way. And in a way that I think obviously most people don't take it. For most people, sex and physical intimacy is also connected with our deepest emotions and emotional intimacy. But if you look at what our society, and therefore with values and principles like faithfulness and family and responsibility to the ones you love, all those things are really built on and connected to the sexual instinct. The sexual instinct is no longer just free floating. But if you look at with what we're bombarded with in society, the goal is really to detach our emotions and our own sensitivities and our principles and values from our sexual impulse, right? And to undermine all those values and all the relationships. What do all those values do? They tether the sexual instinct to institutions like family and marriage and parenthood and commitment to other people, loyalty to other people, right? Willingness to sacrifice for other people. He thought again of Catherine, Now, Catherine is his wife. It must be 9, 10, nearly 11 years since they had parted. It was curious how seldom he thought of her. For days at a time he was capable of forgetting that he had ever been married. They had only been together for about 15 months. The party did not permit divorce, but it rather encouraged separation in cases where there were no children. Catherine was a tall, fair-haired girl, very straight with splendid movements. She had a bold, aquiline face, a face that one might have called noble, until one discovered that there was, nearly as possible, nothing behind it. Very early in their married life, he had decided, though perhaps it was only that he knew her more intimately than he knew most people, that she had, without exception, the most stupid, vulgar, empty mind that he had ever encountered. She had not a thought in her head that was not a slogan, and there was no imbecility, absolutely none, that she was not capable of swallowing if the party handed it out to her. The human soundtrack, he nicknamed her. This is obviously a cruel description. He named her in his own mind. Yet he could have endured living with her if it had not been for just one thing: sex. As soon as he touched her, she seemed to wince and stiffen. This is rather comical, and I think it's intended to be, biting, but also funny at the same time, in an ironic way. To embrace her was like embracing a jointed wooden image, and what was strange was that even when she was clasping him against her, he had the feeling that she was simultaneously pushing him away with all her strength. The rigidity of her muscles managed to convey that impression. She would lie there with shut eyes, neither resisting nor cooperating, but submitting. So you see that they're involved in the act, and when it says she's neither resisting nor cooperating, but submitting, she's not submitting to him so much as she's submitting to the acceptance that this is what is done to reproduce children, right? She's submitting to the party ideology as it pertains to sex. It was extraordinarily embarrassing, and after a while, horrible. Now you see why it's horrible, and you see why the cruel description, because the party's ideology has come between the intimacy of two people, right? Maybe they wouldn't be perfectly adapted for one another, even if there were no party ideology, but you can see that she sees this whole act not as a product of her own instincts and natural impulses, but rather as a duty to the party. I mean, once the party has told you that this act is disgusting and revolting, right, the only reason you're going to do, and you really believe that, the only reason you're going to do it is duty to the party to produce children. But even then, he could have borne living with her if it had been agreed that they should remain celibate. But curiously enough, it was Catherine who refused this. They must, she said, produce a child if they could. So the performance continued to happen once a week, quite regularly, whenever it was not possible. She used even to remind him of it in the morning, as something which had to be done in the evening, and which must not be forgotten. Now you tell me, someone reminds you in the morning of something that has to be done in the evening and must not be forgotten. That sounds like something you don't want to do. It sounds like brushing your teeth or scrubbing the toilet or something like that. She had two names for it. One was making a baby. It could be worse things. And the other was our duty to the party. So you see very clearly here how the party, its ideas, its ideology, have really intervened and destroyed the possibility of intimacy between two human beings, and that's the goal of this, to keep people divided on the most intimate levels. Quite soon he grew to have a feeling of positive dread when the appointed day came around. But luckily no children appeared. This is a very dark description, cynical, pessimistic. And in the end she agreed to give up trying, and soon afterward they parted. Winston sighed inaudibly. He picked up his pen again and wrote. She threw herself down on the bed, and at once, without any kind of preliminary, in the most coarse, horrible way you can imagine, I pulled up her skirt. So, why are we, as the reader, learning about this story? Because he is trying to recollect his past and piece it together in a coherent narrative with all the relevant facts in the mosaic to see what his life has really been, because he can't see it. And that's also to say who he really is. Right? Continue on page 67. He saw himself standing there in dim lamplight with the smell of bugs and cheap scent in his nostrils, and in his heart a feeling of defeat and resentment, which even at the moment was mixed up with the thought of Catherine's white body, frozen forever by the hypnotic power of the party. Why did it always have to be like this? Why could he not have a woman of his own instead of these filthy scuffles at intervals of years? But a real love affair was an almost unthinkable event. The women of the party were all alike. Chastity was deeply ingrained in them as party loyalty. By careful early conditioning, by games and cold water, by the rubbish that was dinned through them in school and in the Spies and Youth League, by lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and martial music, the natural feeling had been driven out of them. So human beings have a powerful, most average human being has a powerful sexual instinct. It's one of the most intimate elements of their own identity. Most people, everybody is different, and therefore this natural impulse is habituated out of them in a very strategic way through a very kind of prefabricated education designed to destroy, not even so much repress in a sense as destroy this impulse, to make what is the most pleasurable experience in many ways for people to be one of the least pleasurable. His reason told him that there must be exceptions, but his heart did not believe it. They were all impregnable as the party intended that they should be. And what he wanted, and he's talking about the women, he can't find a woman who has this just natural desire for free love, right? And of course, today I think the strategy for destroying people's intimacies, family bonds, is actually just the opposite. Instead of treating sex as something revolting, we turn it into something petty, which is something slightly different. And what he wanted more even than to be loved, was to break down that wall of virtue, even if it was only once in his whole life. The sexual act successfully performed was rebellion. So let's be clear here that the political implications for this personal act, they're just, the personal and political are inextricable. This man is not trying to be a political activist. He's simply trying to live his life and be who he is, but he can only do that by coming into conflict with the regime because of the nature of it. Desire was thought crime. Even to have awakened Catherine, if he could have achieved it, would have been like a seduction, although she was his wife. So now we turn to page 131, where Julia explains some of her own experiences in work, which is connected with sex, and gives you another insight into the party's treatment and control over people's sexual desires and their sex life. So one thing we discover, she works in the fiction department of the Ministry of Truth, and something called pornsec or pornosec, which I suppose is the pornography section, and she produces kind of pulp erotic literature for the proles. So it's interesting. The party members have a kind of puritanical ideology as it pertains to sex, and that's what the party promotes. But the proles are given erotic literature, right? And one seems to wonder that the function of that is to dissipate them, to break down their bonds through psychic attachments to the stuff they're reading and looking at, rather than to actual human beings. I mean, one of the interesting things you can look at in recent years was, I mean, really in the last 15 years, the internet has continued to explode in unprecedented ways, and it's really transforming. I mean, this isn't a news to anyone, but it just continues to escalate, transforming our relationships with one another. And one of the things that's been written about a lot in the last, say, 5 to 10 years is on the impact of the pervasiveness of pornography in our culture, precisely because the internet makes it completely accessible and anonymous, and you don't even, as a kid, you don't even have to go into the 7-Eleven or the porn store to try to buy it, and it's accessible and pervasive in a way that it's really never been, probably in American society, and I'd have to say probably in world society. And that is probably not a good thing, because perhaps it would be better to invest one's emotions in other human beings, flesh and blood, rather than in dissipating one's most powerful feelings in front of a screen. Okay, so she works in pornosec. He learned with astonishment, on page 131, that all the workers in pornosec, except the head of the department, were girls. The theory was that men, whose sex instincts were less controllable than those of women, were in a greater danger of being corrupted by the filth they handled. They didn't even like having married women there, she added. Girls are always supposed to be so pure. Here's one who isn't anyway. So this really plays on this kind of basic kind of sex stereotype. We would call gender sex stereotype of men, libidinous men, and more innocent girls. She had had her first love affair when she was 16 with a party member of 60 who later committed suicide to avoid arrest. So here is this, she has a relationship as a 16-year-old with a party member of 60. Now, apart from the dramatic difference in age, this really raises the specter of Julia's function in this relationship at all. Yes, she agrees she enjoys a certain type of freedom and rebellion, but also one wonders if she's not being used as bait to catch party members who are not acting sufficiently dutiful, and that they are disposed of. Either he kills himself to avoid the consequences, or if he hadn't killed himself, he would have suffered the consequences that the party meted out. And a good job too, said Julia. Otherwise, they'd have had my name out of him when he confessed. Since then, and is she telling the full truth? We never really find out, right? Of course, we know that in book 3 she rats him out, and the question is, does she rat him out because, of course, the strain she's put under and the torture is just impossible to overcome, right? Inhuman. Life as she saw it was quite simple. You wanted a good time. They, meaning the party, wanted to stop you from having it. You broke the rules as best you could. Okay, so this is why she's a rebel. She is not unintelligent. She has a certain a sense, a kind of intuitive intelligence about her. She's not exactly like intellectual or book smart or something like that. So she has this just native impulse against being restricted by the party, and that's what makes her rebellious. She's not some kind of wonkish political dissident. She seemed to think it just as natural that they should want to rob you of your own pleasures as that you should want to avoid being caught. She hated the party, and said so in the crudest words, but she made no general criticism of it. She speaks crudely. She speaks in old speak, right? And what is it about her? There's something about her impulses that allow her to break through the lies of the regime and the delusions that they try to perpetrate on people. Except when it touched upon her own life, she had no interest in party doctrine. He noticed that she never used newspeak words, except the ones that had passed into everyday use. She never heard of the Brotherhood and refused to believe in its existence. Any kind of organized revolt against the party, which was bound to be a failure, struck her as stupid. So maybe she's just kind of brutally realistic in accepting the reality of this world and trying to make the most of it within what she thinks is actually possible. The clever thing was to break the rules and stay alive at the same time. This is her point of view. He wondered vaguely how many others like her there might be in the younger generation, people who had grown up in the world of revolution, knowing nothing accepting the party as something unalterable, like the sky not rebelling against its authority, but simply evading it, as a rabbit dodges a dog. So she's younger than Winston, and their different orientations toward the party in part come from their different ages, because they lived through different times and saw different things. The only thing she's ever seen and known is the power structure of the party. Winston doesn't have a clear recollection of the previous world, but he has a sense through his parents, to the extent he had contact with them, that there was another world, that maybe a better world, a past. They did not discuss the possibility of getting married. It was too remote to be worth thinking about. No imaginable committee would ever sanction such a marriage, even if Catherine, Winston's wife, could somehow have been gotten rid of. It was hopeless, even as a daydream. So they're sitting there talking to one another. Page 132. He says, at the bottom of 132, "Our duty to the party," said Julia promptly. "How do you know that?" She says, "I've been at school too, dear. Sex talks once a month for over 16s, and in the youth movement, they rub it into you for years. I dare to say it works in a lot of cases, but of course, you can never tell. People are such hypocrites." And a hypocrite is a person who presents one image and is really another behind. I mean, what's terrifying is this society is, hypocrites to me sound pretty good compared to this society, because people don't even have the freedom to be a hypocrite, because the society reaches into your mind and surveils your thoughts, and they have ways of getting access based on your conduct. She began to enlarge upon the subject. With Julia, everything came back to her own sexuality. As soon as this was touched upon, in a way that she was capable of great acuteness, unlike Winston, she grasped the inner meaning of the party's sexual puritanism. It was not merely that the sex instinct create a world of its own which was outside the party's control, and which therefore had to be destroyed if possible. So there it is. This is what Winston has been yearning for. Why was there's the Puritanism? Because sex and the instinct of sex created a world of its own, of intimacy, of loyalty, of connection, which was outside the party's control. Think about Pausanias and the Persian tyrant controlling people's ability to form love relationships, because it empowers people, and it's outside the party's control because it's our strongest impulse, and which therefore had to be destroyed if possible. What was more important was that sexual privation induced hysteria, which was desirable because it could be transformed into war fever, leader worship. The way she put it was, and I'll get to that in a second. So number one, it undermines relationships, but it also becomes a reservoir of emotional energy that needs an outlet. And precisely because the sexual impulse has been frustrated, right? It's only natural that it would come out as rage or anger, which they directed what? At Emmanuel Goldstein, at Eurasia in the battle they're in, the enemy, the evil enemy, the diabolical other, right? So they take the sexual impulse and sublimate it, if you will, and direct it toward another object other than another human being. What is this? Divide and conquer. Now, who's the real enemy? The real enemy is not Eurasia. The real enemy is, or are the people upstairs, is the people upstairs. The party is the real enemy. But you're being distracted by that by taking this emotional energy that's built up in like a crucible and then pushed it out away in the opposite direction from the true source of the problem. Let me tell you, this is real life. These are strategies, psychic strategies used to control people in political regimes. She says, when you make love, you're using up energy, and afterward you feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. They can't bear you feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and 3-year plans and 2 minutes of hate and all the rest of the bloody rot? This was very true, he thought. There was a direct, intimate connection between chastity and political orthodoxy. For how could the fear, the hatred, and the lunatic credulity which the party needed in its members be kept at the right pitch except by bottling down some powerful instinct and using it as a driving force? Now, there's a great line from Montesquieu in his Spirit of Law, his famous work, in which he talks about how monks come to love the rule they live by, the orthodoxy that they live by, precisely because in frustrating their sexual impulse, that privation they experience only makes them more zealous believers of the very principles that take away their ability to satisfy their desires. The sex impulse was dangerous to the party, and the party had turned it to account. They had played a familiar trick with the instinct of parenthood. The family could not be actually abolished, and indeed people were encouraged to be fond of their children in the most old-fashioned way. The children, on the other hand, were systematically turned against their parents and taught to spy on them and to report their deviations. Think about today, people are being told in this age of coronavirus to rat other people out for things like not wearing masks and so on. Tell the authorities. There's a wonderful movie called The Lives of Others, which I encourage you all to watch, which deals with the theme of, it takes place in communist East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there is a playwright and his lover living together, and she's done something that makes her subject to being blackmailed, and she is brought in by the East German police and say, since we caught you doing this, we want you to inform on your lover, your boyfriend basically, that she's living with. And she is forced to inform on him while all along he thinks they're just kind of innocently in love. And it's very disturbing the way in which this type of regime intervenes in interpersonal relationships on the most intimate levels. And if you don't think this happens, you need to open up a history book and read about it, because it is historical fact. We're not talking here about fiction, except in that this is a kind of generalization of like what things happened in these kind of regimes. The children, on the other hand, were systematically turned against their parents and taught to spy on them and report their deviations. The family had become, in effect, an extension of the thought police. The children were the thought police. I mean, not the primary police officers, but they had become police officers. They had become recruited, you could say. It was a device by means of which everyone could be surrounded night and day by informers who knew him intimately. Surrounded by informers, that's just another word for permanent surveillance of the most intimate and intrusive variety. Okay. So now I want to conclude looking at O'Brien and Winston's relationship, starting from book 1 and then its culmination in book 3. So on page 17, there's just this little glimpse. At first, O'Brien is just a little glimpse out of the corner of Winston's eye. At the top of page 17 in the middle, to dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do whatever else was doing, was an instinctive reaction. So they have something called face crime. I mean, it's almost like FaceTime or Facebook, but face crime. To dissemble your feelings, it's to conceal, to be duplicitous, to conceal your true feelings by presenting yourself in a way other than you really are. Because if you expose your real feelings, you'll be guilty of a thought crime, right? So, but there was a space of a couple of seconds turning, which so what's the context here is that people can't make knowing glances at one another. Like, let's say you both think the regime is a sham. You can't look at one another in public and shake your head, say, this is all gobbledygook, right? But he has just one of these, or he thinks he has just one of these moments with O'Brien, and it's ambiguous as to the true meaning of it. And perhaps the meaning of this little incident here doesn't become clear until book 3. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during which the expression in his eyes, O'Brien's, might conceivably have betrayed him. And it was exactly at that moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen. Actually, in Winston's eyes, he betrays himself. His true thoughts come out. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second when their eyes met. It's like all intimacy between people happens in this fraction of a second. And for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew. Yes, he knew that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. Now the question here is, was O'Brien thinking the same thing as himself? Well, let's first start, what was he thinking? Something about, we're both aware that we don't like this regime and we don't subscribe, we don't accept what it's doing to us. That's essentially what the thought is, because that's exactly what Winston feels. Now, why does he assume that O'Brien feels this way? O'Brien gave him some type of glance, right? But this is a projection of identification from Winston onto O'Brien. He is in need of someone who is sympathetic to his point of view about the regime. He wants to see that there's someone out there who thinks the same way. This is as he does, and this is one of the most powerful ideas. It's one thing to think a certain way in society, but it's another thing to actually know concretely that there are other people out there that think the same way you do, right? And that is incredibly empowering when you become aware of that. Now, this goes back to this Aristotle's claim. The desire for friendship arises faster than its reality, right? And what does that compel us to do? To deceive and self-deceive, to project our own desires on others. And that seems to be what Winston is doing here. It turns out, I mean, O'Brien is a kind of a bait, and he is a kind of a double agent. He's befriending Winston, and he's giving these types of signals to Winston, but they're not actually what they don't turn out to be what Winston thinks they are. An unmistakable message had been passed. It was as though the two minds had opened and their thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. I am with you, O'Brien seemed to be saying. I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust for the party and the regime. But don't worry, I am on your side. Now, of course, O'Brien is not on Winston's side, but we don't know that yet at this early stage. And then the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was as inscrutable as everyone else's. So everyone has to keep their face, what? Inscrutable. Meaning they conceal what's going on inside and don't let anybody see. Because they'll get caught if they expose their true feelings. Because their true feelings, naturally, are not going to be consistent with a regime like this. I would hope, right? That was all, and he was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had a sequel, i.e. to confirm or disprove. All that they did was to keep alive in him the belief or hope that others beside him were the enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies were true after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions and executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Now, O'Brien's face, his expression alone, not only to Winston says, "I'm with you, and I feel your pain," but it also leads them to the conclusion that maybe the Brotherhood is real, because maybe O'Brien is part of the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is the group of resistance to the party. Even Winston is aware that the Brotherhood may be a complete myth, right? If it is a myth, it's just a mechanism to control people who would consider rebelling. They go searching for a Brotherhood that doesn't exist, and then they get caught in the process. On page 25, as a follow-up to this interaction, toward the bottom of the page, just says this: Winston had never been able to feel sure. Even after this morning's flash of the eyes, it was still impossible to be sure whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy. He's a frenemy, right? You know what? If you take our own normal, ordinary reality, he turns out to be an enemy. But if you take the perspective of the regime, oh, they're friends, right? Because you make words what you mean, because the party holds truth, and they can make words mean whatever they want them to mean. So let's move to page 243. Now, this is early on in Book 3. What has happened at the end of Book 2? Well, Winston and Julia have been engaged in these clandestine meetings above Sherrington's bookstore in this kind of rundown apartment space that has been rented by them to carry on apparently in a concealed way these events. I mean, their relationship. They get caught at the end of Book 2. The helicopter comes in the window. The people come out of the helicopter, and we've seen the police before in helicopters peering into people's windows. Sherrington shows up with the thought police, and Sherrington looks different, and he now discovers that Sherrington has never been a prole who simply owns his bookstore. He's been surveilling them, and this whole operation with the apartment above is all a kind of pre-planned trap, it seems, if you start thinking back on the whole situation and him renting it to him. So at the beginning of Book 3, he's being taken inside the Ministry of Love, which of course where law and order is maintained, right? Despite the fact that there is no law in this society. And if you remember in Book 1, Winston makes a point of telling us that he's never been inside of it. He doesn't know anyone who has. He has no clue what's inside of the Ministry of Love. He just knows that there are all these barricades and barbed wire to get in, and it's very restricted only to elites. And he doesn't have the access to be in there. So now he's in there, and it is a place that's all light and shining. And there are these lines early in the book that he has these dreams. I'm going to meet O'Brien in a place where there's all light. And the light and everything being white is kind of reminiscent of a kind of hospital, kind of sanitary, institutional type of environment. It's very impersonal. It's very stark. The light is very bright and uncomfortable. And it's also a kind of metaphor for the kind of exposure that there is no place to hide for this character. And we're talking about there's no place to hide in here, right? In most totalitarian, in most tyrannies, you can think what you want, but not in this one. They control what you think. And it's at this moment that he discovers O'Brien's role in his life is very different than what he presupposed. On 243, he says, "It was O'Brien who had been directing everything. It was he who set the guards onto Winston and who prevented them from killing him." So now, the Ministry of Love, to the extent we learn about it, is a place where people get tortured and they get re-educated until all those rebellious thoughts are flushed out of their mind and washed out of their mind, and that they accept Big Brother and that they love Big Brother. And of course the famous lines is he says, "I love Big Brother," right? And stripped away from his psyche is everything that has made Winston human, everything that's allowed us to identify with him. And Winston doesn't die physically here, but he dies psychologically, because he is literally no more after what they've done to him or what they do to him in these events. And it turns out O'Brien is his tormentor, but O'Brien does something very sadistic, which is characteristic of this type of torture and abuse, which is O'Brien plays the role of torturer and savior. He turns up the electricity to harm him, but he also says, "I'm the one who can help you." This very perverse action. It says, "It was O'Brien who was directing everything. It was he who set the guards onto Winston and who prevented them from killing him. It was he who decided when Winston should scream with pain and when he should have a respite, when he should be fed and when he should sleep, when the drugs should be pumped into his arm." Now think about it. O'Brien has a kind of godlike power over Winston. And on one hand, Winston, our natural reaction is that we want to be in control of ourselves. But there's going to be such a point where O'Brien has such power over Winston that Winston is going to accept it and beg for him to stop, and will accept him as this kind of almost a kind of godlike being. It was he who asked the questions and suggested the answers. He was the tormentor. He was the protector. He was the inquisitor. He was the friend. And once Winston could not remember when it was in drugged sleep or in normal sleep or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured in his ear, "Don't worry, Winston. You are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." And he was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," in that other dream 7 years ago. So you notice he has a dream for 7 years ago, and this is the very moment that O'Brien really came into the life of Winston, which is to say, O'Brien has been surveilling specifically and targeting Winston and watching his, you could say, thought crimes develop over time, and then he's at the stage he meets him, he brings them out by giving him the book, Emmanuel Goldstein's book on the true nature of the regime. What's the goal of the torture? On page 245, O'Brien says this, "I am taking trouble with you, Winston," he said, "because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what is the matter with you. You have known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge. You are mentally deranged. You suffer a defect of memory." Now, in fact, it's just the opposite. Winston is sane. He's responding to this world in the way any sane person would. And in fact, his memory is not perfect, but relative to most people who have had their memory suppressed, he remembers very well. And that's part of the problem. You are unable to remember real events. Now, real events are fake events. You keep track of this now? And you persuade yourself that you remember other events which never happened. The events which never happened are the real events which did happen, and they're his own life. Fortunately, it is curable. You have never cured yourself of it because you did not choose it. There was a small effort of the will that you are not ready to make. Even now, I am well aware you cling to your disease. His concern for the truth is his disease, under the impression that it is a virtue. And he goes on to ask him who's at war with whom and so on. And of course, Winston gives the correct answers, which are the wrong answers. 248. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered that it meant what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or other a place, a world of solid objects, where the past is still happening? No, said Winston. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It is written down, mnemonics. In records and in the mind, in human memories. In memory. Very well, then. We, the party, control all records. We control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It is outside oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. So he's giving him electrical shocks every time he gives the wrong answer. And he's going to continue to shock him until he gives the right answer, which is the true answer, which is simply what the party wants to hear. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You preferred to be a lunatic, a minority of one, which is to say a believer of the truth. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be true is truth. Holds to be truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. This is the fact that you have got to relearn, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of will. You must be humble. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. Now, an act of self-destruction. What is really necessary here? Winston needs to have his true memories of his own life destroyed because they are not in conformity with what the party wants. And it's even more diabolical than that. O'Brien wants him not only to destroy himself, but to accept and embrace the destruction. How is Winston trained? Among other things, he's injected with drugs, and he's given electroshock therapy, and he's told that he's holding up four fingers, that is, and he's asked how many, and of course he says 4 fingers, and O'Brien wants the answer of 5, even though there are only 4. 2 plus 2 equals 5, as you all know. So on page 252, this kind of reaches a climax. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out his arm and laid it on O'Brien's arm. O'Brien plays this perverse role of tormentor and savior simultaneously. It's very disturbing. He had never loved him so deeply as at that moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. So why does he love O'Brien? Because O'Brien is the one in control of the pain, and when the pain goes away, he loves O'Brien for making it stop. The old feeling that at the bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Perhaps one did not need to be loved so much as to be understood. O'Brien had tortured him to the edge of lunacy, and in a little while it was certain he would send him to his death. It made no difference. In some sense, that went deeper than friendship. They were intimates. Somewhere or other, although the actual words might have never been spoken, there was a place where they could meet and talk. O'Brien was looking down at him with an expression that suggested the same thought might be in his own mind. So we've seen that before. When he spoke, it was easy. It was in an easy conversational tone. "Do you know where you are, Winston?" he said. "I don't know. I can guess. In the Ministry of Love?" "Do you know how long you've been here?" "I do not know. Days, weeks, months. I think months." "And why do you imagine that we bring people to this place?" "To make them confess." "No, that is not the reason. Try again." "To punish them." "No," exclaimed O'Brien. His voice had changed extraordinarily, and his face had suddenly become both stern and animated. "No, not merely to extract your confession, nor to punish you. Shall I tell you why we brought you here? To cure you, to make you sane. Will you understand, Winston, that no one whom we bring to this place ever leaves our hands uncured? We are not interested in those stupid crimes that you have committed. The party is not interested in the overt act. The thought is all we care about. We do not merely destroy our enemies. We change them. Do you understand what I mean by that? I'm not sure he does, but we're going to get an answer as to what that means. He was bending over Winston. His face looked enormous because of its nearness, and hideously ugly because it was seen from below. Moreover, it was filled with a sort of exaltation, a lunatic intensity. Again Winston's heart shrank. If it had been possible, he would have cowered deeper into the bed. He felt certain that O'Brien was about to twist the dial out of sheer wantonness. At the moment, however, O'Brien turned away. He took a pace or two up and down, and then he continued less vehemently. "The first thing for you to understand is that in this place there are no martyrdoms." Now, what does he mean by a martyrdom? Killing people for their beliefs? But what do martyrs do? They die for their cause, and they're seen by everyone dying for their cause. And when they die, they still believe in their cause. By avoiding martyrdoms, what do? They change people's minds, and they make them believe exactly the thing that they're rebelling against. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past. In the Middle Ages, there was the Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended up perpetuating it. For every heretic it burned at the stake, thousands of others rose up because they saw the heretic burning at the stake, and it pissed them off. Why was that? Because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they were unrepentant. Now they don't kill them. Now they kill them psychologically. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victim and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned him. Later in the 20th century, there were the totalitarians, as we call them. They were the German Nazis and the Russian communists. This is a regime that's even, quote-unquote, more perfect as a totalitarian regime. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew, at any rate, that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude until they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever was put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse, accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy. And yet, after only a few years, the same thing happened over again. The dead men became martyrs, and their degradation was forgotten. Once again, why was it? In the first place, because the confessions that they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We do not make mistakes of that kind. All confessions that are uttered here are true. We make them true. And above all, we do not allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you. Winston. Posterity will never hear of you. Why? Because Winston will go down the memory hole. You will be lifted clean out of the stream of history. We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you. Not a name in a register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will have never existed. You are thinking, he said, that since we intend to destroy you utterly, so that nothing that you say can make the smallest difference. In that case, why do we go to the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you were thinking, was it not? Yes, says Winston. So they have this mind meld, and this is part of the intimacy, as disturbing as this relationship is. O'Brien smiled slightly. You are a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not tell you just now that we are different from the persecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it will be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil, all illusion, and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, not hypocritical appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be. Even in the instant of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake, still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy and exalting it. Even the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in his skull as he walked down the passage waiting for the bullet. But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotisms was, "Thou shalt not." The command of totalitarians was, "Thou shalt." Our commandment is, "Thou art." No one whom we bring to this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean. Even those three miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. In the end, we broke them down. I took part in their interrogation myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, groveling, weeping, and in the end, it was not with pain or fear, only with petulance. There was nothing left in them except sorrow for what they had done, and love of Big Brother. That is the meaning of the ministry of love, to make you love Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot quickly so that they could die with their minds, while their minds were still clean. Conclude we've developed from, or developed from this relationship with Julia to O'Brien, and then ultimately to Big Brother. A myth, right? But since whatever the party says is true, is reality, right? And how is that achieved? Through applying so much pain and suffering that you're willing to accept anything as true if it means the suffering stops. So the truth is backed, so the truth of the party, which is a lie, right? It's hard to keep all this intact because you've got the point of reference of truth being based on external reality and truth being based on what's people are compelled to believe. But ultimately what this leads is to his acceptance and love of Big Brother, which just means what? It means that any human spark, any individuality that existed in Winston is brainwashed out of him. And I'll just leave it with this. This is utterly diabolical. But if you look at the ideology of this regime in Book 3 about the role of power, and actually O'Brien goes on to critique the failures of the Nazis and the communist Russians. They didn't do it right. We've perfected totalitarianism in this world. The techniques that you see on display here can be found in our history politically. Various types of experiments that have been done on human beings against their will. So in the end, Winston has come to love Big Brother.